Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the Facts and Fallacies podcast. My name is Cameron English. That's Dr. Liza Dunn.
Hi, everybody.
Liza, it's so good to see you. It's been an exciting week with so many things going on. Well, apparently, we're on the cusp of World War III, so I thought it'd be great to do a science podcast.
That sounds so wonderful. So people can get distracted a little bit by science.
Yes. Stop scrolling. Stop the doom feed.
That's right.
Don't look at every news report and every dramatic tweet. It's not good for you.
That's right. This is going to be a healthy break.
Yes, indeed. And what we thought we'd do today, again, a departure from the three-story thing. We don't have a guest this week, which we've had quite a few of lately. We're just going to riff on this theme of improving science journalism and as well the content that comes out of science journals, which fuels a lot of the news content that you read. Maybe talk about some of the key problems. There's reoccurrent issues that always show up, and then some solutions to them that, if implemented, would do a lot of good in terms of improving the public's understanding of science and dampening down some of this fear that's always circulating online. And I think counteracting the health influencer phenomenon that just drives me up the wall.
Yes.
If I watch another video of someone walking down a grocery store aisle and pointing out an obscure ingredient, I just might jump out my own window. I'm just so tired of it. But that's a rabbit trail we won't get down right now. But the reason we wanted to do this in particular is because on our space today we were talking about pesticide safety, and it was motivated by a story that Time magazine published earlier in June. And it was a pretty typical story. It's the sort of stuff that we deal with constantly, almost constantly. Mm-hmm. But for a lot of people, and I've realized this on our spaces, a lot of people, it's new information.
That's right.
That they're being manipulated or deceived, or in some cases, the journalists are just ignorant. They're not in on, the campaign. Sometimes they are indeed.
They're being useful idiots.
Yes, they're being played, and I think it plays to their ideological sympathies, because a lot of journalists, I've heard this from, his name escapes me now, I'll think of it when I don't need to know it, but he's a longtime journalist, and he was pointing out that when he was up and coming, he did a lot of consumer reporting, consumer affairs reporting, mm-hmm. And when you're in that field, or if you're in a field where you're covering big government agencies or corporations, you start to develop this mindset of identifying the bad guy. There's always a bad guy, and the bad guy usually wants to make lots of money. And so that becomes your sort of working
mantra.
Yes.
Or storyline. Yes.
Yes. That's your working assumption about whatever story you're covering. And so if someone comes to you, say an environmental group, and they say, hey, we've got evidence that Corporation X made product Y and they lied about product Y's health effects, the story writes itself.
You got
a
story.
Writes itself. Right. So we figured maybe we'd go through some specifics and try to make things better. Or at least if people want to do better, they can use this as sort of a guiding light. But Liza, what are your overall thoughts? I mean, you do this more intensely than I do, and it must drive you up the wall to read the news sometimes.
So it does drive me up the wall to read the news sometimes, because people are so panicky about being poisoned. I mean, you would think that medical toxicology would be the most popular specialty on the earth, given how much discussion there is in the public about being poisoned. And everybody, the doctors are, saying this, public health people are saying that, we've got this epidemic of chronic diseases, and the chronic diseases are due to the way we grow and process our foods. And so we need to go back to the way Mother Nature intended, which means we're all going to starve to death. And people should be much more afraid of that than they should be afraid of anything that is in their food. We've got the safest, most abundant food supply in the history of mankind. And because we don't have enough to worry about, there's got to be something. And I think that this is where it's going. It's also very lucrative for people to make other people scared about things in their food supply. We heard some pretty amazing anecdotal stuff today, but it shows you how impactful this messaging is. We heard, about how terrible it was that the EWG can detect traces of pesticides and make them seem like they're really, really high doses that people are getting in their diet. And that's what they claim is to blame for this epidemic of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and obesity is coming from. And the truth of the matter is the reason why we're getting those diseases is because we're living past the ripe old age of 5, because we're not dying of infectious diseases. And now I'm seeing these folks want to dismantle the things that prevented their children from getting infectious diseases in the first place. So the anti-vaccine movement, the anti-fluoride movement, the water sanitation, let's go drink raw water, that kind of thing. The push against pasteurization, the real concern about antibiotics. Now, I think you need to be concerned about antibiotic resistance, and you should be good stewards for it. But being so worried about your microbiome that you're not going to ever take an antibiotic puts you at risk for diseases that can be fatal. So the consternation about the advances of the 20th century that brought us an unprecedented life expectancy is something to behold. And apparently we don't have any collective memory of what it's like to die of diphtheria and polio and other diseases. And it's pretty remarkable. And the press is lapping it up, hook, line, and sinker. It's very disheartening sometimes.
So let's get into some examples of the sorts of things we're talking about. I'll start with the one that drives me most insane about reporters, is that they are fair weather advocates of science. So, for example, in the story we talked about today, the June 5th Time story, I think it was called Are Pesticides on Your Food Dangerous or Harmful or something like that. Sometimes when you have a loaded question, it's not loaded necessarily, but when you have a question like that as a headline, what they're trying to do is insinuate some sort of danger without committing themselves to it. Now, sometimes that's okay as a conversation starter. I'll do that with my headlines, but there's usually context following the question, or the body of the article makes clear exactly what's going on, and that's missing from a lot of these stories. So when I say fair weather advocacy, I mean, over the last month or so, ever since that Maha Commission report came out, every journalist and every fact checker rightly came out and said, there's fabricated footnotes in this report. Apparently, whole portions of the text were just AI generated, and nobody at any of the departments bothered to
had exactly. Yeah. Nobody had written it. They was like, we didn't write that.
Right. So they came out and they lambasted HHS for that, and rightly so. But the same people then turn around and they will cite that report. They'll say, HHS has put out a report indicating that pesticides pose a risk to children, and they increase the risk of chronic illness, and you know what I mean. So in other words, the same document in this case that you have to reject when it comes to vaccines. or whatever. It's an authoritative source when they're talking about pesticides, and this happens often, right? Environmental Working Group, which believes the kookiest, most unscientific things, is a source to be rejected on certain topics, but then the media will turn to them and treat them as experts on the chemistry of pesticides, when in fact, as far as I know, there's one person at EWG that has a degree in toxicology. Everyone else is a lawyer. Right? You know
Go
what I mean?
figure.
Right, and she's there, the woman I have in mind, she's there to provide the veneer of credibility, right? According to toxicologists so-and-so, these pesticide levels or whatever, right? She's the dial-a-quote that the media can rely on, and she's got some credential. So that's my biggest problem. There's lots of examples. It happened a lot during COVID. The same people who said, you got to get the COVID vaccine, you got to get your booster, don't believe the misinformation, are now quoting RFK's HHS on pesticide safety.
Right. That's exactly right. And that is mind blowing to me that they can, it's fascinating to listen to this bunch of academics who, get so upset with people who don't listen to the science when it comes to vaccines or whatever they're saying, and then turn around and, if it fits their narrative, that then they won't listen to the science that's supports the use of pesticides. And pesticides are critical for public health. I will not quit saying that. And so the whole notion that you're being poisoned by the very thing that is protecting you from malnutrition and from insect-borne illness is mind blowing. It's mind blowing. I mean, they want you to get a vaccine because it prevents infectious disease transmission. This is the same thing. It prevents the transmission of infectious diseases that often don't have any treatment. West Nile, Zika, and those diseases do all of the things that they make the claims about for tiny pesticide exposures or tiny plastic exposures. If you get mycotoxins in your food supply, those are endocrine disruptors. Those cause cancer. They can do all sorts of different things, right? And there's no discussion about what you need to do to prevent that contamination and prevent that very natural thing from happening to your food. Same thing. They'll say this about pesticides and plastic in parts per trillion cause endocrine disruption in children, and then the same exact people will get on and say, "Oh no, but it's perfectly okay to put your kid on cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers," which definitely leads to infertility. And I don't. It's also that mixed messaging from that many different avenues is a perfect opportunity for people who are malign individuals to seize the day and make a profit off of the fear that's generated from that mixed messaging. And there are people, they're lawyers, they're supplement dealers, they're doctors in wellness clinics and all sorts of things like that. And I'm going to say that there are some doctors who genuinely believe this stuff because they are just being sort of shifted into an arena where they don't have any significant training, but they believe what they read, just like the average person does. And a lot of it's just coming from I'm going to say it's from people with vested interests who are publishing junk science that then gets sensationalized by the media, and the average consumer of the media, and this includes physicians, is not equipped with the kind of training or time even to adequately assess that literature and what the media is saying.
It's a real problem because the incentives are backwards. So maybe that can be number two is scientists and academics who enable this behavior from the media. I see this all the time. And the incentives for researchers are such that you want to bring press to your science, right?
Right.
So the university press office is going to hype whatever they think is most newsworthy about your study, whether it's true or not, whether the implications are correct or not. They're going to tell the public what they think the public wants to hear. They're going to do what they need to do to get coverage of the research. And oftentimes that means leading with something that's either flatly false or it's misleading. Right?
Yeah,
so
it's just as long as it's sensational.
Right. So they'll find some chemical in somebody's urine, or they'll, we dissected a dead person's brain and we found something in their brain, and now you should be scared because, But in order to understand that study, you have to read it. You often have to read the supplemental material, which is actually really difficult because it's table after table, statistic after statistic. It's hard to put that in context if you don't have the training. And nobody does it. The media doesn't do that, and the people with the expertise who wrote the paper, who should be there to say, make sure you supply this context, don't do that because it's in their interest to make their own research scary.
Yep.
And that is extremely, extremely frustrating.
It is, and especially when it's taking on actually very well structured, reproducible, established research, right? they're making claims about chemicals because based on one flawed study, as opposed to all of the bodies of studies that are out there that demonstrate safety of vaccines. I mean, everybody goes back to the Wakefield article, even though it was retracted. The impact that's had has been just extraordinary for somebody who wrote a fraudulent article, and there are children who have died because of that article. And it's mind blowing to me that that hasn't resulted in litigation against the people who perpetrated that paper, as opposed to trying to set up litigation with against pharmaceutical companies, which was what that paper was designed to do.
A related issue is that the media will often perpetuate nonsense that everyone knows is nonsense, but they do it because it's a story. So today, if you read any science communicator, anyone in the little field of my job is to promote science, they will all, again, correctly chastise the influencer culture, right? The people that spread silliness about vaccines or food safety. RFK Jr. is crazy and he's deceiving people, and this group is deceiving people. Yes, yes, yes. But what almost none of them will say with any great detail is that it was the press, it was the mainstream press for decades that flacked this anti-vaccine narrative. And let me read this. This is from the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. This is a group that's affiliated with the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where Paul Offit is based. Dr. Paul Offit is one of the world's leading vaccine experts. To show you how much I appreciate his work, I own like 3 or 4 of his actual physical books, not just the ebook version.
Wow.
So I actually own the books, and I've held on to them over the years because they're great for background information. But anyways, not that I deserve a gold star for that. I'm just pointing out that I take this work seriously. The College of Physicians of Philadelphia points out that starting in the 70s and later on in the 1990s, it was the mainstream press that was promoting this. So this is a direct quote. Television documentaries and newspaper reports drew public attention to the controversy, speaking of the anti-vaccine controversy. And then they call out a documentary that was produced by NBC called DPT. They got the initials backwards, by the way. DPT Vaccination Roulette. And like I said, produced by NBC. And the whole thing was that, children were getting this vaccine and it was causing neurological damage. And this played a very important role in amplifying the anti-vaccine movement. And of course, probably a lot of the people listening to this weren't alive in 1982, but
right.
But there was no Instagram in 1982, right? There was basic cable. I mean, there was probably more. Right?
It was a little more than smoke signals, but not much.
Right. So you had cable. There were movie stores. You could go to a store and rent VHS tapes. Kids, those are like DVDs, but clunkier, and the quality's worse.
That's right. That's right.
And a lot of people probably never had to use DVDs either. I am getting old. Anyways.
Just you wait.
My point is, in 1982, the media was people's primary source of scientific information. And of course, there was no digital archive of PubMed papers.
There was no internet.
So if you were going to get medical or scientific information, you had to subscribe to one of these journals and have them send it to you. Or you had to go to the library and read back issues. You know what I mean? It was much harder to get information. So when people were learning about vaccines, they were getting it from NBC.
That's right.
And so for decades, these reporters were flacking this controversy over and over again. And then, a few decades later, we have a sizable anti-vaccine movement in this country whose figurehead runs Health and Human Services now.
Which is insane.
Right. And so none of the fact checkers, none of the journalists, none of our colleagues in SciComm, right? Nobody looks back and goes, wow, you guys really screwed this up. What do you have to say for yourselves? There's no demands that NBC, lose their access to experts, right? We just carry on like these people are a reputable news source.
That's
but
right.
I would like to know, why did you do this for decades? Now are you pretending like this is just some crank belief?
That's exactly right, and I think it's because you got kind of caught with your pants down. I mean, seriously, everybody got into their echo chamber. It started out the anti-vaccine movement started out very much on the left. When the COVID vaccines got introduced, you've got everybody on the left saying it was rushed. We can't trust the science behind it. All of this kind of stuff, and then when they got into power, it went a complete 180, and they're wondering why people are suspicious of the COVID vaccine, and then by default, after the way they managed this, of all vaccines, you had a huge fall off on vaccine uptake because of the propaganda that came around. It's become a bipartisan thing. But I really feel strongly at this point with the COVID vaccine, that was the left's doing that started that whole all of that drama. And then I harp on this transgender stuff, but I think that saying that there's a scientific basis by which it's okay for you to castrate children, that was a nail in the coffin for believing anything scientific. You have real science. You've got scientists in academia who've largely done one of two things. They've said, I'm just busy doing my work. I'm not paying attention to that. I'm going to keep my head down. I don't want to get in trouble. Which shows you how powerful that propaganda is. If it's scaring senior scientists into not saying something, that's obviously basic biology. One, or they were buying into it wholesale and just out of the clear blue sky. You need to believe the science, but I can't tell the difference between a boy and a girl because that's not my subspecialty. Whatever. I mean, that's, and I'm starting actually to see more newspapers coming up with that. I think the New York Times actually said something after this recent Supreme Court decision, talking about how maybe this is gone. They did it. They obviously couched it in the whole bunch of activists on the right are pushing their agenda. But I think that people are starting to become cognizant of the fact that if you can't tell the difference between a boy and a girl, then why do we have to trust you on anything? And I think that the newspapers and magazines have wholeheartedly participated in this, and it's been a fascinating exercise in watching how propaganda gets translated, and it's destructive propaganda. The whole anti-pesticide thing. You've got people who are so scared of Lyme disease that they get chelated and say that that this is a terrible thing and doctors don't know what they're doing and all of this. All they need to prevent Lyme disease is a little bit of permethrin, right? But they're so scared of that they are willing to get chelated and take months of antibiotics and stuff like that because of the fear around this organism. And I just do not understand it. Normal everyday toxicologists who should know better are concerned about plastic being poisoned. And it's mind blowing. It's mind blowing. Plastic is preserving your food. You talk about food waste. Plastic residues on your food are keeping your food fresh, keeping it not moldy. You don't want to waste food. You keep on telling everybody they should eat all organic and stuff like that. If you want to preserve your food so it doesn't go to waste, that's what you got to do. You got to put it in plastic.
One thing about the trans thing where people say, the right wingers are using it for their agenda, I think that's really rich coming from people who refuse to speak up. So, and I alluded to this last week when we were talking about the sex spectrum debate. A lot of the people who make that accusation, they downplay the fact that it's people that are right of center. And interestingly, not a lot of them. I mean, there are some right wingers that have latched onto this issue, but Jamie Reed, as we've said on this show, is a left-wing lesbian, okay?
That's right.
married to a detransitioning woman. I mean,
Yes.
like that is the farthest from right wing. Colin Wright, the evolutionary biologist, who I also referenced last week, he's a left of center avowed atheist. He's like, you
Yeah.
know what I mean? This is not a Tucker Carlson loyalist.
Yes. No,
And
not at all.
but nevertheless, the point that I wanted to stress is that, the people at the Manhattan Institute, which, as I've said, is sort of a right of center think tank, they're doing these investigations. They're filing FOIA requests against Texas Children's Hospital, for example, because no one else in science has the courage to call out Medicare or Medicaid fraud at
Yes.
major children's hospitals. And they
Yes.
don't have the courage to stand up for doctors and nurses who are being prosecuted by the federal government for telling the truth about illegal
That's right.
activity by their employers. So if you're going to make this, it's a right-wing talking point, then you have the courage to stand up and call out corruption and dishonesty and unscientific behavior. When the American
Yes.
Academy of Pediatrics comes out after this major Supreme Court decision earlier this week, and they say the scientific consensus is that children need access to gender affirming care, you need to stand up and go, well, that is a complete lie. Because if
That's
you're
right.
familiar
Because
with
the
that,
evidence, you as physicians have bandy the term evidence-based medicine around all of the time. And the evidence should point you in the direction of the truth. And the evidence just isn't there that this is beneficial in any way, shape, or form, unless you have a disorder of sexual development. That's a separate thing. Or if you're grown up, I don't care what you do. I have questions about the physician that's doing that to you, but I don't care what you do. Kids cannot be. You can't do this to kids.
I think that's all true. And I think what needs to happen is people need to be honest about that, and they need to be honest about their biases. So if you listen to this podcast, I don't talk a lot about my politics, but it's clear where I stand. If you listen to this show, you know basically where I stand on a lot of issues, and that's okay because I'm not trying to hide anything, and I want people to know that you can think all sorts of things about politics and religion, and you can still like science. You can still basically look at a scientific issue and go, I'm okay giving my kids vaccines because I don't want them to get some infectious disease that could kill them.
That's right.
I'm okay feeding them conventionally produced food because it's safe and it's nourishing and it's what they need as they grow, right? That stuff is true regardless of, what church
Whether
I
you're
go to
left,
or,
right, upside down.
Right.
I mean,
So what I would really like, and this is a problem in science media too, I would really like people to come out and say, this is my opinion. Politically, this is what I think. Nevertheless, I'm not going to go along with this silliness because my team is doing it, right? And
That's
that's
right.
really hard. That's why people like Colin Wright gained a following, is because they came out and they said, like
this is not right. Yeah.
right. I'm left of center, but I'm not going along with this. I'm not going to stand here and nod my head in approval as you put kids on drugs for prostate cancer. Like, I'm not going to do that. You're
No.
insane.
No, that's exactly right.
So in other words, I don't know, to try to boil this down to a simple point. If you have a bias, it's okay. It's like everyone has opinions. It's fine. But you need to be open about them, or you need to be able to set them aside enough to write about your topic. So if you're a reporter, if you're covering something controversial, that needs to be transparent. Or you need to cover stuff where your politics or your ideals don't influence what you're writing.
Yep.
Because what's happening is you're either misleading people who believe you, or you are pushing away the public that won't trust anything you say because they can see through what you're doing, right? So like in the Olympics, this boxer who was beating the hell out of
that woman,
out of female boxers, everyone like, well, she's obviously a woman. It's like, she obviously is not. She is obviously a he, okay? And it's now been confirmed. Right. It's now been confirmed that is the case.
That's right.
I forget the Algerian boxer, was it?
Iman Khalif, is that right?
Right. I think that's right. Yeah, and I hope I have the country right. But
Algeria. Right, yeah.
Team Science came out and they said it's misinformation if you're critical of this, and how dare you be so judgmental
of men beating up women.
Right, and now it's been confirmed, and no one's going back and going, oh, whoops, I was wrong about that. No one's doing that, and so. Nope. This is what I'm talking about, is like, you can't keep doing this and then expect the public to go along with you.
one. And two, you can't keep doing this and then expect to be accorded. Um, Women fought tooth and nail to get some equality in the early 70s. When my aunt was getting divorced, she had to ask her husband for permission to get a credit card. And I'm seeing the complete erasure of women on all sorts of fronts. So men in sports, men in girls' spaces, medical journals talking about, they'll have a a section on a problem that men have, and then they'll call women people who have wombs or bleeders, or I mean, just insane, right? That no, you don't. I am a woman, and you will not talk to me like that. And you're a medical journal, and you should know better. That it's infuriating to it's interesting because there's this whole controversy about the young woman who was brain dead, and wound up, if she was pregnant, so they kept her on life support until the pregnancy was she came to term, and the baby was delivered, and there's all this outrage about being her being in that position. And I don't want to get into the ethics of all that, but the complaint is that she is not just a vessel for another being, right? She's not just an organ, but that's what the medical journals are calling us, right? So if you don't want to be treated like that, then stand up against it. It's and once again, a lot of people are just putting their heads down. And when you put your head down, the truly brave ones, the ones who like stick their head up early, because they're the ones who get their heads chopped off, right? But the ones who do it in a way that is persuasive, like Jamie Reed. Jamie Reed really believed when she went in to this that there was science behind it. Why? Because the medical people were telling her that. And the thing that makes me also crazy is that the claim is that the doctors are getting paid so much money to do this. That's not true. The hospitals are getting paid a ton of money, but the doctor, there are lots of doctors sitting in the back when I don't want to participate in this at all, but I'm too scared to lose my job, and so it's a mess.
I don't want to get too bogged down in that because I have a young daughter now, and so
Mm-hmm.
when I hear people say that the thing to do to stand up for civil rights is to let men in private spaces where women are undressing, or where or letting
Yeah,
them compete with teenage girls. I'm like, you are outside of your mind if you think that I and
that's
other
okay.
parents are going to stand for that.
No.
And I don't just mean like we're gonna get upset on Twitter. You do not understand the fight that you are picking when you go after
Yes.
somebody's kids like that. And not only do you do that, but you chastise them as bigots.
Yes.
I'm just telling you, that is not a fight that you're going to win, one way or another. One way or
Yes.
another. So your PhD and all of your smuggery and all of your news coverage, I do not care. I will absolutely not have that debate with you. That is just not going to be allowed. And
Yep.
you have to realize this. Like, this dynamic affects all of the scientific public health issues
Yep.
that we care about. You cannot look at people and tell them things that are demonstrably false that they can verify with their own eyes,
Yeah.
and then point to your graduate degree and go, well, I'm the expert. It's like, well, my eyes work, right? I know the sky's blue. I know grass is green, right?
Yep.
So if you have this expert insight, then you need to explain what you know.
Yes,
Don't
and
just
this is not bigotry.
yeah.
I don't care. I have no problem if grown-ups want to do this. Once again, I have a problem with the doctor, but so what? But if a grown-up wants to do this, I don't care, and I don't care. I have no problem if people are gay. I have nothing, no problem with that. You just stay away from the kids. Stay away from the kids.
Um, yeah. Yes. Yeah. Woo. Yeah. I'm getting fired up. Okay. I don't want to get hung up on this, like I said before I got hung up on this. Um, Another thing that we could focus on that would make science journalism better, I think, is just a more general familiarity with the topic. So
Yes.
I I write a lot about all sorts of different scientific topics. I'm not an expert on any of them, and I've never portrayed myself that way. But I have people like Liza on speed dial, right? So the reason I know you, the reason we started collaborating, is because I was writing a story about the neurological effects of a pesticide, and I was
Hmm.
looking at some research, and I needed to make sure that I was interpreting it correctly. And I
Yep.
was referred to you by somebody else, and when you told me stuff, not only did I hear it from other people,
Hmm.
but but in other words, it was clear to me that you were giving me good information, and as a result of that, I started to develop a deeper understanding of these topics. And I think journalists more generally need that, because
Yes.
a lot of the reporters who cover this stuff, you know, their beat is environmental journalism. I mean, that
Right.
encompasses everything from climate change to pollution in rivers to, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Like, that could be anything. And what happens so much of the time is they report on stuff that they clearly don't understand. And this was the case with the Time article that we discussed today. Is this researcher was linking to studies and saying, you know, pesticide exposure increases the risk of birth defects in women and children who live in agricultural communities, right? So what that says to the public is if you live somewhere where there's farming, your baby might be born with deformities or something. Like it's left to them to
It's,
interpret.
yeah, to suss that out. Yeah.
Right. Now, when you look, and I did this just, and this is another good tip, always click the links. When a story gives you links to scientific stuff, click on it and verify it, because there's like a 65% chance that they're fibbing. They're making stuff up. And when I clicked on one of the links, sure enough, the study that they were looking at was a case control study, which means they're looking backwards in time, and they were comparing. I gotta go back and look at the design. Basically, they had urine samples from a very small cohort of women, and there were metabolites from a pesticide in their urine, and then they correlated that with, you know, the babies being born slightly later or slightly earlier, and this was taken as a link, right, an association between pesticide exposure and birth defects. But
Which is
that's yeah,
outrageous to make that claim,
yeah.
especially since we've got a 2 week window on the front end and a 2 week or 3 week window on the back end for when a baby is due, right? And all of a sudden, if you find pesticide metabolites in the urine, everybody's like, "Oh, we know precisely to the hour at which point this baby should have been born. They were born a day early." That's just not scientific. Just not scientific at all.
And the reason I bring that up is because what I'm willing to bet happened is that this reporter went to PubMed, and because this was part of the story, looked at pesticides and birth defects, found a handful of abstracts from PubMed, which is a great resource if you know how to use it, and just inserted them into the story. And none of the fact checkers at Time, none of the editors at Time knew enough about the subject to go, hey man, you better explain the limitations of this paper, or you better find better research. Now, the reason I say that is because everything I write for ACSH, it's reviewed by a couple of MDs and a PhD chemist, like people with extensive professional experience, and an FDA regulator, by the way, because Henry Miller used to run the Center for Biotechnology at the FDA. So if I write something and it's wrong, I get called on it. And even when I'm not wrong, sometimes they'll go, "Hey, you need to double check this. You need to make sure that you know what I mean?" And it's clear to me that that's not happening with these reporters. They don't have anyone around them who's going, "This is wrong. This needs to be more nuanced." And when they are going to experts, they're going to experts who work for an NGO, or they're going to experts who may be at a university, but they, like UCSF, right? They're part of a program that's funded by like a foundation or something that has an agenda. And so they're like, the things that they're trying to claim are just being confirmed, right?
And they
That
will not talk to anyone that they perceive to be as biased, which means they will not talk to an industry expert, no matter how much expertise they have. Because the claim is, oh, they've got industry funding and that's corrupt, as if other kind of funding, foundation funding, isn't corrupt, right? So I think that the funding question doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has is corrupt or is unscientific. But industry scientists are very good at what they do, and they are a veritable fount of information. If you go, and they would appreciate it if somebody would just ask them for their side of the story, because obviously if the product is a blockbuster, it's addressing a need that a huge percentage of the population has, right? So you may want to talk to the people who invented it, who did the studies on it, who brought it to market, and found a niche that was so important for the ordinary people to use this product that it wound up becoming very, very successful. You might want to talk to those experts because they invented it. And they'll often be a wealth of really good information for you.
And this leads to my final observation, and then whatever you want to add, Liza. One of the things that happens is what we talked about in our space, which is this sort of false balance that is created. So one of the bedrock principles of journalism is balance. If you're telling a controversial story, you're supposed to present all sides of the discussion to your audience and then let them decide. That's a great principle to go on, but the problem is that reporters, they stick to the technical, like the letter of the law, but not the spirit of it, so to speak, right? So what they do is they will give you a balanced story that's heavily slanted in favor of one side, and then they will give the other side a quote, usually like in the middle or at the bottom of the story. So for example, after they've presented this narrative about pesticides giving you cancer and the manufacturer lying about it and all of these lawsuits that they've lost, then they give a quote to someone from industry who says, the latest research shows that our product is low risk and it doesn't cause this disease. But they front loaded the story with all of this priming, right? They've primed people to reach one conclusion, and then you get to, Fred Smith from the Pesticide Coalition or whatever. I made that name up, by the way. And then you go, yeah, this Fred Smith guy is a shill. Obviously, he's going to say that, right? But these independent guys at the Environmental Working Group,
they make a whole lot of money,
right?
Yeah.
Right. All of these, right? In other words, so they've twisted the audience's perception, even though they're technically being balanced in a very narrow sense of the term, right? So stop doing that. Don't do that, right? You need to, and here's the thing, and I'm not to sound cynical, I don't think this is going to happen. So I think the ultimate solution is that these newspapers, these news outlets, even a lot of these journals, they're just going to have to run out of money and run out of an audience. That's the only way it's going to be fixed, I think.
Yeah, there goes my dog. But I think there are some resources that some journalists can use. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Maybe we could put it in the show notes somewhere, that I thought was I was going through it. I was thinking to myself, how do journalists have access to scientists? Sometimes it's very hard to get. Most scientists like to do their science and a lot of them are introverts. A lot of them aren't interested in really sort of public speaking and stuff like that. So a lot of people speak for them. So how do you get access to a scientist that can vet your stuff? And I think that you're really lucky with having that whole team there. But there are some resources for journalists that you can Google where they can vet an article for you and translate it in a way that you can, a complicated scientific article, translate it in a way that you can understand, and then give you a list of things that might be flawed in there and might be right. And if you go to use those kinds of resources, that can at least point you in that direction. They can translate kind of what the critiques of the article were, and things like that. Read the letters to the editor too. So, when that splashy paper came out saying that, black plastic, you need to throw it all out because it's got flame retardants in it and it's hurting you. That was just, it was a bogus science. And if you read the discussion around it and then read about the calculation error that they made, that would give you pause and make you kind of question the credibility of this article. And of course, you don't want everybody in the world going out and throwing out their black plastic. they can't afford to replace all of their utensils. One, and what are they going to do? The same people are saying you shouldn't recycle plastic. So what are you going to do with all that plastic? I mean, it's the circular firing squad. You can't win for losing. But so check out those kinds of resources that give you some good, easy to understand discussion.
Yeah, one of them is called the Science Media Center.
That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, with the R before the E because they're European and sexy that way. But they're very helpful because I don't know if they will vet your stories for you, but they like a study will come out that's controversial or about whatever topic. They have a list of experts who will review the paper and then they will put out summaries with quotes that you can include in your story. And if you contact them, they will give you information. That's been enormously helpful over the years. And you're right, like not every science writer has friends who are like, "Oh, I used to work at the FDA," right? That I'm blessed to have that benefit. But if you need to go outside of your little circle, it's not that hard to do. And reporters know how to do this. This is part of being trained as a journalist. So for example, I wrote a story a few years ago about genetically engineered wine grapes and why they're not on the market and how the science works and what sort of research is being done. Nobody at ACSH has expertise in that. So I went to one of my typical sources in plant genetics, and he said, this is a bit outside my expertise. You need to talk to so-and-so at the University of whatever. And so I reached out to that person, and then I got in touch with another little like little niche group of people that just tweak wine, right? Like wine grapes. That's all they do, right? They mess with the genetics, then they grow them, and then and then back to the drawing board. And they're making progress in breeding these varieties of grapes that have all the traits that wine drinkers like. I'm not a wine guy, so I don't know anything about it, but they're like, because you have to keep it's this grape and it has to have this dryness.
You've got these sommeliers who trained for decades to have a little flavor.
Yeah, it's pure snobbery, and I get why people like it, but it's just it's a foreign world to me. I don't like it at all. Anyways, but I went to these people, and you're right, they're like super quiet. They're not, but they were willing to talk to me about their research, and because of that, I had good sources and good information for my readers. And you have an obligation to do that as a journalist. And I think a lot of people, a lot of reporters, they think they're doing that, but they're not. They're deceiving people or misleading people. And that has to stop. And if it doesn't stop, the media landscape is going to continue shifting, and people are going to keep going to Joe Rogan and other podcasters.
That's right.
They don't trust you anymore. So
that's exactly right.
Okay, let me see if I can remember everything I said. So don't be a fair weather fan of science. That's bad. Don't do that. Don't hype scares for decades and then turn around and go, we're all trying to find the guy who did this. It's like, right, clown. If you have some sort of bias, that's okay, but be honest about it. Don't fool yourself. And then don't present things with false balance or false imbalance, right? Paint the picture as it actually exists in the world and let people decide. It's the best thing to do. It's so refreshing when I find something like that online. I love it because I go, oh, good. I can look at this and be confident that I'm at least getting a baseline understanding of this.
That's exactly right, and it may be something that opens your mind to a new idea. I think that we had a couple people on the space today that had not heard the stuff that we were saying before, and I think that they came in with a bunch of preconceptions that they then all of a sudden got, well, maybe there's a different story, and they might not believe the story, but at least they were willing to engage.
Oh, let me add one final one. Admit when you're wrong. And this so sucks. I don't like doing this. Fortunately, it doesn't happen too often because I've got people around me who call me out before I publish stuff. But every once in a while, I'll get something wrong on this show because I say a million things in an hour or in an article, and you just correct it. It's not like it's good for you.
Exactly
It builds your
right.
reputation. I'll give you one example that it kind of irritates me that I was wrong about this. But Mike Adams is a goofy anti-vaccine weirdo. Like he called the COVID shots bioweapons. He just promotes weird things. He attacks people that I work with and respect as murderers. Like he's a scumbag. But he published an article during COVID where he said there's mandatory vaccines coming and they're coming for your kids, and And I responded to that, and I mocked him, and I said, "You're stupid. There's no mandatory vaccines. No one's doing that. Blah blah blah." And sure enough, a few months later, the administration came out and they said, "Everyone get this, or you're fired, and your kids can't go to school." Right. So the next article I wrote referencing Mike Adams, I had to go give the devil his due. He was right. He was right. Right. Now he's
Yes.
wrong. He's wrong about the bioweapon. He's wrong about the deadly spike protein thing. What like all of those things were wrong. But I had to say, you know what I mean? I was wrong about this. He called that.
Yeah.
You know?
I think that builds trust. And if people who generally oppose you on things are right about something, if you give them that uh, olive branch, sometimes that opens up dialogue. So, if you're willing to go and talk to people who disagree with you, and then if you can find something where you do have an agreement, that often opens up the door for a better dialogue than just he said, she said, he's bad, she's bad, this, that, and the other. So I think that's a good takeaway.
That's right. Be humble just like me. I'm very humble, and it's good for you to be humble too.
It very much is. It very much is.
That's a joke, everyone. I know it's not humble to call yourself humble. I get it. I get it. Okay. Okay. All right. We're going to leave it there. We've been talking for almost an hour because we care so much about this. But let's make science journalism better. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to say that. Let's make science journalism really good like it was previously. Everyone have a great week. Thank you for joining us. Our spaces are every Friday, 11 a.m. Central Time. Show up. If you don't agree with us, you go to the front of the line. We'll let you speak first and most because we want to have a good dialogue. If you have questions, bring them. We always have a handful of experts on different topics to discuss them. Follow us on X at Dr. Liza MD. I'm at Cam J English. Thank you so much. We will see you next time.
All right. Bye.